In 1497, a monk walked into a dining hall in Milan and saw something that made him stop cold. Painted across the entire north wall was Christ and his 12 disciples caught in a single frozen moment of chaos. 500 years later, we're still staring at that same wall, and we still haven't fully figured out what we're looking at. This is Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, and it might be the most scrutinized, most debated, most quietly mysterious painting in the history of art. Today we're going deep into why. Let's find out. Let's start with the basics, because even the basics here are strange. Leonardo painted The Last Supper between 1495 and 1498 on the wall of the refectory that's the dining hall of the Santa Maria delle Grazie convent in Milan. He was commissioned by Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, and the subject was one of the most painted scenes in Christian art. Jesus sharing a final meal with his 12 apostles before his arrest and crucifixion. Simple enough, right? Except Leonardo didn't paint the calm, orderly version everyone else had painted before him. He painted the exact moment Jesus says, "One of you will betray me," and then he painted the chaos that follows. That single choice is where the mystery starts, because instead of 12 men sitting quietly at a table, you get 12 men reacting all at once, all differently. Leonardo split them into 4 groups of 3, each one caught mid-reaction, mid-argument, mid-thought. Some are leaning in, some are recoiling, some look accusatory, some look devastated. It's less like a religious painting and more like a photograph snapped in the middle of an emotional explosion. And that's the first thing that should puzzle you. Why would an artist working on commission for a duke painting a sacred biblical scene choose the most unstable, unresolved moment possible to paint? He didn't have to. Every artist before him didn't. Leonardo did it anyway. Now let's talk about the geometry, because this is where things get almost eerie. If you trace every line in that room, the ceiling beams, the wall panels, the edges of the tables, they all funnel toward a single vanishing point, and that point sits right behind Christ's head at his temple. It's not decoration, it's engineering. Leonardo built the entire architecture of the room to physically force your eye toward Jesus. No matter where you start looking, add to that the windows behind him letting in a soft wash of light that sits right around his head like a halo he never actually painted. Leonardo gives you divinity without giving you a single obvious symbol of it. No golden halo, no radiant beam from the sky, just math and light doing the work. And it doesn't stop there. Count the windows, there are 3. Count the disciples in each group, 3. Look at the shape Christ's own body makes with his arms spread and his head bowed, a triangle. 3 points? In Christian theology, the number 3 is the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and Leonardo seems to have buried it everywhere in this composition quietly without ever spelling it out. Some researchers have gone even further, claiming the entire painting follows the Fibonacci sequence: 1 table, 1 central figure, 2 side walls, 3 windows, and so on. Whether that's intentional design or an over-enthusiastic pattern search by modern scholars is genuinely debated. But the fact that people are still finding new number patterns in this wall, 5 centuries later, tells you something about how tightly Leonardo constructed it. Let's talk about Judas, because this is where the real detective work lives. For over 1,000 years before this painting, artists solved the Judas problem in a lazy way. They just sat him on the other side of the table, alone, facing us, so you'd know immediately who the villain was. Leonardo refused to do that. He put Judas right in the mix, shoulder to shoulder with the other disciples, shrouded slightly in shadow, but otherwise indistinguishable at a glance. You have to actually look for him, and once you know where to look, you can't unsee it. Judas is the one clutching a small money bag in his fist, a quiet reference to the 30 pieces of silver. He's also the one who's just knocked over the salt cellar, spilling salt across the tablecloth, a detail that, in the artistic language of the time, symbolized bad luck and betrayal. And most damning of all, if you follow the hands reaching toward the same bowl on the table, you'll notice Judas and Jesus are both reaching for it at the same time. It's a direct nod to the gospel line where Jesus says the traitor is the one who dips his hand into the dish with him. Leonardo doesn't announce it, he hides it in plain sight and trusts you to find it. Now here's the part that made this painting internet famous long before the internet existed to make things famous. Look at the figure seated immediately to Jesus' right. For centuries, this was accepted without question as the Apostle John, the youngest and traditionally most delicate-looking of the disciples. But at some point, people started looking closer. Long, flowing hair, soft, almost feminine features, no beard. And the way the figure leans away from Christ, some have argued, creates a negative space between them that forms the shape of a letter M or a V, depending on who you ask. And so the theory was born. What if that isn't John at all? What's if it's Mary Magdalene? This idea exploded in popularity thanks to a certain best-selling novel in the early 2000s, but it actually predates that book by decades. And on the surface, it's a compelling case. The features really do look softer than the other apostles, but here's the problem. Leonardo painted young men with soft, almost androgynous features constantly. Look at his St. John the Baptist. Same face, basically. Same long hair, same delicate jaw. It was simply Leonardo's stylistic signature for youth. And there's a much bigger logical problem too. If that figure is Mary Magdalene, then where is John? The gospel account is specific. 12 apostles at the table. If you swap one out for Mary, you're one disciple short, and nobody has ever satisfactorily explained who's missing. Most art historians, even today, land firmly on John, but the theory refuses to die because that's the thing about a 500-year-old painting with this much ambiguity. Once a mystery takes hold, it's almost impossible to fully close the case. There's an even smaller mystery hiding on the table itself, and it's one most people walk right past. What exactly is that fish? Because of centuries of damage and repainting, nobody can say for certain whether Leonardo painted an eel or a herring. Sounds trivial until you learn that in several northern Italian dialects of the time, the word for herring was slang for someone who rejects religion, a non-believer. If it's a herring sitting on the table at the Last Supper, that's not a random seafood choice, that's a loaded symbol, sitting quietly among the bread and wine, whispering about doubt and disbelief at the very meal where Christ predicts his own betrayal. If it's an eel, the meaning flips entirely toward faith and spiritual guidance. Nobody can prove which one it is. The paint that would tell us the answer is simply gone. And that brings us to maybe the strangest part of this entire story, the fact that the painting itself has been dying since the moment it was finished. Most murals from this era are frescoes, painted directly into wet plaster, which lets the pigment fuse permanently into the wall. Leonardo, being Leonardo, wanted more control, more subtle blending, more depth of color than fresco technique allowed, so he experimented. He painted onto dry plaster instead, using a mix of tempera and oil. It looked incredible. It also started flaking off the wall within just a few years of completion. By the middle of the 1500s, less than a century after it was painted, visitors were already describing it as a ruin. Add centuries of humidity in that dining hall, a doorway literally cut through the bottom of the composition at one point, Napoleon's soldiers reportedly using the room as a stable, and Allied bombing during World War II that destroyed the roof of the building while the wall somehow survived. This painting has been through more than almost any surviving artwork on Earth. A massive restoration effort began in 1978 and didn't finish until 1999, over 20 years of painstaking work, peeling back layers of old clumsy touch-ups from well-meaning restorers across the centuries, trying to find whatever original paint Leonardo actually laid down. And the results were bittersweet. They stabilized the wall, they brought it as close as humanly possible to its original state, but they also had to admit something painful. Less than half of what you're looking at today, when you stand in that room in Milan, is actually Leonardo's own hand. The rest is lost, replaced by best guesses and later restoration. Thankfully, some of Leonardo's own students made faithful copies while the original was still intact, most notably one by an artist named Giampietrino, painted just a couple of decades after the original. Those copies are now treated almost like historical evidence, helping researchers reconstruct details that vanished from the wall itself centuries ago. So, after 500 years, hundreds of restorations, countless theories, and one very famous novel, where does that leave us? With a painting that is quite literally disappearing in front of our eyes and somehow still refusing to give up its secrets. We know the math, we know the symbolism, we can point to the salt, the bag of coins, the ambiguous fish, but we still argue about who's sitting next to Christ. We still don't fully agree on what Leonardo was trying to tell us or what he was quietly hiding for us to find. Maybe that's exactly why it's lasted this long in our collective imagination. A finished painting stops being interesting. An unfinished mystery never does. So I'll leave it to you. Is that figure next to Christ John, or is there something else going on there? And what do you think Leonardo really wanted us to notice first when we walked into that room? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.